Okay, the topic of this video is joints. Here are the standards and objectives. Pause and peruse. All right, joints. Let's get to it. Joints are also called articulations. Means two bones meet. So a joint or an articulation is a place where two or more bones meet. The functions of joints. So they hold bones together. They bear weight. They allow for mobility. Okay, how are joints classified? Well, two major ways, by structure and by function. Let's look at structure first. Those are often the ones that people are the most familiar with. So in terms of structure, we classify joints by how the bones are held together. So if joints are held together by fibrous tissue, those joints are going to be immovable. They're sealed up. Okay, if the bones are held together with cartilaginous tissue, those are slightly movable. And if the bones are held together with a synovial joint capsule, it's a synovial joint and it's freely movable. Okay. Now we can also classify joints by function. Okay, so immovable is synarthrotic or synarthrosis, like they've been synthesized, they're stuck. Synarthrosis, stuck. Okay, they're immovable. Okay, if they're slightly movable, it's amphiarthrotic or amphiarthrosis. Okay, can go either way. Always think about it like ambidextrous. So kind of movable, kind of not. And then we have freely movable, which is diarthrotic or diarthrosis. Okay, so immovable is either fibrous or synarthrotic. Slightly movable is cartilaginous or amphiarthrotic. Freely movable is synovial or diarthrotic. It doesn't change how the joint functions, it just changes how we're classifying it. All right, so synarthrosis, fibrous, immovable. Okay, those words, all interchangeable. The bones are joined by fibrous tissue. The bones are very close together, even interlocking like puzzle pieces. The sutures of the skull are an example. So you can see that. Look at that suture. That's little interlocking pieces. Okay, very close together. Okay, next, amphiarthrosis, cartilaginous, slightly movable. Again, all interchangeable terms. So these bones are connected by cartilage. Bones are further apart. They're not all right up against each other and even interlocking like the fibrous. Some locations where you find this, the distal articulation of the tibia and fibula, so close to where your tarsal bones are. The two pubic bones, so where your coxal bones join together at the pubic symphysis, right in the anterior part. And between your vertebral bodies, you can see the intervertebral disc. It's a cartilaginous disc, okay, in between the vertebrae. Now, not in between, so here, just let me show you really quickly. So it's in between the vertebral body, right? You don't have over here, between over here, you don't have intervertebral discs there, okay? So you have the cartilaginous here, between the vertebral bodies. Okay, and then diarthrosis, synovial, or freely movable, again, interchangeable terms. So the bones are separated by a joint cavity, so they may be further apart here. And it's filled with synovial fluid and enclosed by a joint capsule, which might be some fibrous tissue on the outside to give it durability. Some have additional padding, so fat pads or menisci, which are fibrocartilage pads, to give it some extra padding depending where the joint is located. All right, sports application. Synovial fluid becomes less viscous or thick when it's warm. This allows the joint to move more freely. So it's just another reason to warm up before you stretch and do other activities. So just like the oil in your car needs to warm up so it can lubricate the car parts, stretching is an important piece. Warming up is an important piece of exercise. It gives you more flexibility. What type of joint is immovable? That would be fibrous. What type of joint is freely movable? That would be synovial. What type of joint is freely movable? Now let's see if you remember the tough terms. Diarthrotic. Now let's go over a feature of fibrous joints, fontanelles and skull sutures. So here we have a newborn skull. At birth, the bones of the skull are not fully formed. There's a large anterior fontanelle, soft spot, and there's a smaller posterior fontanelle, soft spot. Okay, so the newborn skull is not fully formed. The bones are not fully fused. They haven't even fully grown all the way. So it's important to be careful holding babies. You don't want to put pressure with your fingers right into the fontanelle. Right into the fontanelle. So when lifting up a baby from the back, cup your hand like this around the back so that you aren't putting finger pressure right digging into the posterior fontanelle or around to the anterior fontanelle. Be very careful. Okay, so the anterior fontanelle is larger and it's going to close by around 1.5 to 2 years of age. The posterior fontanelle is smaller and it usually closes by around 2 months of age. Now, as the skull grows, sutures are going to form. So as the fontanelles close, sutures form, fibrous joints. You're going to have to learn the names of just 3. Okay, and these sutures are fibrous or synarthrotic joints. Okay, so the 3 that you're going to have to learn are right here on the screen. So first, just to point it out, okay, here is the anterior fontanelle. That's the larger soft spot toward the front, and the posterior fontanelle, the smaller soft spot toward the back. Okay, now the 3 names you need to learn. The coronal suture. So it's going to go like this, just like a coronal section would go like this and separate the anterior and the posterior part of your body. So it's going to be right here. It's going to be between the frontal bones and the parietal bones, the coronal suture. The next one you need to learn is sagittal suture. So just like a sagittal plane like this, okay, and the sagittal suture forms between the 2 parietal bones. And then finally, we have the lambdoid suture. Again, these are not the only sutures, they're just the 3 I'm having you learn. And then the lambdoid suture is between the parietal bones and the occipital bones. Okay, so that is toward the back. Why are babies born with these fontanelles? Well, it allows movement through the birth canal. So you can see this. Minutes after birth, shape of a skull. The skull gets, the head completely gets misshapen as it's squeezed through the birth canal. But after 24 hours, for most babies, that gets resolved. But here you can see an image of why that happens. The skull, the head gets misshapen as it passes through the birth canal. But if the skull bones were fully fused, so those sutures were formed, that would not be allowed to happen without fracturing the skull. So having those fontanelles and having the bones not fully formed means the head can get squished like that to allow for birth. Okay, now let's go over synovial joints. There are 6 types of synovial joints to remember. First, we have a gliding or plane joint. It allows some movement in all directions. Find this in the carpals. Find this in the tarsals. You can see in that GIF, it allows some movement in all directions. Okay. Also the ends of the vertebrae, not in between the bodies, but the ends of the vertebrae. Okay, some gliding plane joints. Hinge joint. Back and forth movement. You can see that in the GIF. The elbow, the knee, the phalanges. Then we have the pivot joint. It allows rotation only. It's between the atlas and the axis. Remember those vertebrae that we needed to know? Atlas C1, axis C2. And also between the radius and the ulna. It allows this movement. Pronation to supination. Well, this is pronation to supination, which we're going to talk about in a later video. Ellipsoidal or condyloid joint. Okay, so it allows movement back and forth plus side to side. So not as limited as this, more movement. And it's between the metacarpals and the phalanges and the metatarsals and the phalanges. Okay, so it allows some more movement. The saddle joint is found in one area, pollex. It allows angular movement, including circumduction, but not rotation, so you can't rotate it. So the pollex, it's the joint between the carpal bones and the metacarpal of your thumb. So the carpo-metacarpal joint. So saddle joint only in your thumb. And then ball and socket joint. It allows all combinations of movement, including rotation. Okay, we're going to talk about all those movements in a later video. Your shoulder and your hip, ball and socket. So the ball of the humerus fits into the socket of the shoulder, and the ball of the femur fits into the socket of your hip. What type of joint is found at the hip? We just talked about it. Yep, ball and socket. What type of joint is found between the atlas and the axis? Yep, pivot joint. Only place, well, primary place. What type of joint is found at the elbow? Yep, a hinge joint. And there you have it. That's joints. 3 main categories classified by structure, 3 categories classified by function, and I hope that you learned something new today.